Well, thank you so much, Paula, and thanks so much for having me here. I don't know if you guys sort of watch this. I give a lot of speeches, so I'm sort of watching trends in who shows up on podiums these days. But there's a trend of sort of putting someone up on the podium who doesn't work in your field. And there's no apparent connection between what I do and what you do. And at the best, this is really great because you get this sort of outside perspective on what's going on. You get a different lens on sort of the work that you do. At the worst, you're sort of left asking, who the hell is this guy and what the heck is he doing at the front of the room? And so with that in mind, I thought I would try to explain to you what it is that I do in the hopes that I can then connect it to the conversation that we're about to have. So as Paula mentioned, I work at the Media Lab. The Media Lab is the weirdest part of a weird institution. MIT is such a crazy place. We have the ability to major in things like naval engineering. And if you can't find the discipline somewhere at MIT, you end up in the Media Lab where you end up sort of creating your own discipline to study something that isn't a field yet. And I got hired into MIT to run this lab called the Center for Civic Media because we decided we needed some sort of new field. And by the way, I mean a funder decided we needed a new field to think about a very challenging question. And the challenging question is this. We know that the space of media is changing. We know that it's getting far more participatory. Everyone's creating content. Everyone's sharing every moment of their day. And we think this is changing what it means for people to be citizens, what it means to be civically engaged. Maybe it's not about attending the town planning meeting anymore. Maybe it's about the online petition. And somewhere in those intersections between participatory media and civic involvement is what we try to do. And so what that means is we study things like protests that get organized online. We study things like viral video campaigns. We're very interested in this question of Facebook revolutions. Did digital tools actually help bring about the Arab Spring or Taksim in Turkey? And actually answering that question would take the rest of the time that I have here on stage, so I'm just going to leave it hanging there like so many other things. We even study some of the dark sides of this, like the anonymous movement, political protest in cyberspace. I had a student write a great thesis about DDoS, denial of service, disabling web servers as a form of political protest. And we try not to just sit here and sort of go rah-rah for this. We try to ask some skeptical questions about it as well, because one of the things that we're finding in new media spaces is that we sometimes get exaggeration and distortion. This is Mike Daisy. This is another complicated topic that we could easily spend 20 minutes on, but we'll just put him up there as a slide. We spend a lot of time in my lab talking about this idea of slacktivism, activism that makes you feel like an activist, but you didn't actually do something. You just liked something on a Facebook page. You may be noticing that despite the fact that we have more information out in the world, it's not always the right information or the most believable information. And even these campaigns that sometimes take us all over the world, rallying millions of young Americans to start caring about Central Africa, which on the one hand is a really good thing, can end up very, very complicated and distorted. And again, Coney 2012, something we're not going to talk about, but worth another 20 minutes if you can find me in the hallway afterwards. But we try not just to write about this, we spend a lot of time building things. So we build things like a platform that lets people blog from prison. It's a mail-based blogging platform that allows the incarcerated to maintain an online presence as a way of thinking about reentry into society. We spend a lot of time thinking about media impact. We did a bunch of work on a tool called Page 1X, which allows you to track stories on the front pages of newspapers to try to get the sense of how a story is rising and falling over time. We write tools that work for newspapers and also end up as critiques of newspapers. This is a tool that we've been doing around the Boston Globe that asks the question, how does the Boston Globe represent Boston? Where do we get a lot of attention to the city? Where do we get very little? And what do we say? And we end up sometimes with very uncomfortable discoveries where we discover Mattapan, a community of color in Boston, rarely makes the Boston Globe unless we're talking about basketball or murder. And this becomes very uncomfortable as sort of a mirror to hold up to some of the media that we end up encountering. And we try to make everybody uncomfortable. We try to make me uncomfortable by building tools that let us look at our own behavior. One of my master's students who spent the last 2 years thinking about gender and how women are represented in the news built a tool to ask the question, who do you follow on Twitter? Who do you pay attention to? And then required me, if I wanted to show his work, to show my data. So I have to show up and admit that I follow almost twice as many men as I follow women on Twitter, which is something that every time I put up, I end up thinking about, and I change who I end up following on Twitter, adding more women after the fact. If you're a man who'd like a follow after this talk, you're out of luck. Women, feel free to come talk to me with your Twitter handles. This is what I do during the day, but I also have a second job. And the second job isn't taking this sort of critical look at how media is getting used. It's really trying to help activists figure out how to use media. And a lot of this work started with Global Voices, which was a project that we started about 9 years ago, asking this question, what do we know about the developing world, and shouldn't we hear about the developing world through the voices of people in those countries? So Global Voices now has about 1,400 volunteers, publishes a daily site that sort of serves as an overview of what conversations are happening in social media around the world, which often turn out to be conversations about social change in one fashion or another. And I got roped into a project called Ushahidi, which I now chair the board of, which is Kenya's leading software developer, which built a tool to map the violence in the aftermath of Kenya's 2007 elections, which now turns out to be sort of the leading tool that people use all over the world to try to get a geographic overview of what's going on in a crisis situation, whether you're responding to a hurricane, whether you're responding to a botched election. And all of this, in turn, actually has taken me over to the dark side. I have become a grant maker. And so I now sit on the global board of Open Society Foundation, which is a really interesting place to sit because I've just spent a good chunk of the last month trying to figure out where $900 million of giving goes a year as we've gone through our annual budgeting perspective on all of this. And so my job in all of that is to really ask this question, is there a change happening in civics, in media, in grant making? Are we seeing some sort of a sea change that's taking us from older ways of thinking about how change happens in the world and taking us into some sort of a new paradigm? And what I want to put forward here is this basic case. I think there's pretty good evidence that the space of media, particularly news media, is changing really radically at the moment. And I want to put forward a slightly more tenuous case, which suggests that the way people do civics, and particularly young people, and I'm mostly going to focus on young people in the United States, but I see some evidence for this for young people internationally, how people get engaged in community life or in social change is changing. And I think, but this is really almost purely a hypothetical, that we're starting to see some of these same changes come in the space of arts. And so I throw this out, this last one, mostly as a provocation because I'm trying to figure it out as well. But on the media side, I am pretty comfortable making the case that everything we knew 20 years ago no longer makes sense. And I'm comfortable making this because in our field, the biggest sort of argument we've had over the last 2 months was about this piece. And this was a piece that came out of the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. 3 scholars there decided that they were going to do the definitive biography of how digital revolutionized the news. And they called it Riptide. And Riptide has a really interesting significance to it. It implies something that no one saw coming that's going to drag you out to sea to drown you. And this is very much how people who have ink-stained fingers end up feeling about what's happened with digital media. They really felt like they didn't see it coming and that it's had transformations to the industry that they haven't figured out how to recover from yet. And this project has come under a lot of different criticism, but it's actually a really nice way of getting a sense for how uncomfortable, how unfamiliar that world is for people who feel like the ground has changed under them. And the ground really has changed under them. These are photos from Taksim Square in Istanbul, where we recently had the Gezi Park protests. And one of the things that happened with the Gezi Park protests is that the Turkish media was so heavily pressured by the Turkish government that they didn't cover the protests for a number of days. You could turn on Turkish CNN, and you would get a cooking show, and you could turn on CNN International and you would get international protests, but you were not getting anything showing up on local websites or showing up in local media, in part because you had such a constrained media environment. But you've had a shift where people now go out to protest, go out to take any sort of civic action, armed with cameras, armed with laptops, and they're self-documenting. As they go out into the streets, they're creating the media as it goes. And so in this particular case, much of what we know about what happened in Gezi Park was documented by the activists, with all the good and bad that sort of comes from that. But we're seeing this sort of happen all over the world. This slide, which is impossible to see, although it's slightly better over there, is a great visualization done by a computer scientist, Kalev Litaru, who's looking at how we know different parts of the world. And on that map, Google News is in red and Twitter is in white. So if you see something lit up in red, you're basically hearing about it mostly because you have professional journalists paying attention in places where people don't have a lot of access to technology. If you're seeing it lit up in white, you're often getting a lot of that news from people who are tweeting it, who are sharing it, who are somehow trying to broadcast what's going on themselves. And smart media organizations are figuring this out, and they're embracing it. We've sort of gone through, 10 years of Sturm und Drang in media, and now you have the august New York Times actually running a blog section, and we've hit a point where two of the better respected, talked about, argued about journalists in the world, Glenn Greenwald and Nate Silver, are both bloggers at their heart. That's how they started. They didn't go to journalism school. They didn't work their way up from the city desk. They started writing online, and they've ended up having an enormous amount of social and civic impact. Now, we're seeing some of these same changes going on in the government sphere, but they're happening just a little bit more slowly. I like to talk a lot about this site, the We the People site. This is a real signature effort from the Obama administration to sort of say, look, we get it. We've got this form of representative democracy from the 18th century. Maybe it made sense when you had one representative per 30,000 people. It doesn't work so well with one representative per 600,000 people. So maybe you should have a voice. You should come and say whatever you want to say online. We'll give you a response. We may not do what you say, but at least we promise to listen to you, except for the fact that we're not listening to you at the moment because we've shut down the damned government. And so the point that I want to make here is not so much what the Obama administration, or frankly anybody else, is doing to try to change and digitalize civics. The point that I actually want to make is that if you are 20 years old, this is not the place you are looking to figure out how to make change in the world. The idea that your job as a 20-something is to read the newspaper and every 2 years to elect a representative who's going to speak for you in Congress is bullshit. And it just doesn't make sense. It's not something that people of this generation relate to in any way, shape, or form. And so we look at falling voting rates, we look at falling interest in politics, and we go, this is terrible. We have a generation of people who aren't interested in civics, and that's bullshit too. They're simply doing it really different ways. This is Carmen Rios. She's a college student. She's at George Washington. She did something pretty remarkable. Her response to the Steubenville rape case was to say, I'm really concerned about a culture of rape in high school athletics. And I think that we're not doing a good enough job of talking about it in the home or talking about it in the classroom, so I want the coaches to talk about it. If you're on a sports team, I want part of your responsibilities as a coach to be to talk about sexual assault and to talk about those power relationships that end up happening. And so she ended up setting up an online petition that got 70,000 signatures basically overnight, pressuring a national coaches association, which then called her up and worked with her as well as other people who had gone through college athletics, including a Colby University football player, to design a curriculum to try to get coaches to talk about sexual assault at the high school level, trying to prevent something like Steubenville from happening again. I look at folks like the Harry Potter Alliance. This is a bunch of Harry Potter fans who, as the series was coming to an end, said, we don't want to be done with this. We want to figure out how we take these books and how we live them in our lives. We want to become Dumbledore's army. We want to take the values of the Harry Potter books and we want to make them real. And those values are really interesting. They've seen a lot of really interesting ideas around education. They've been buying libraries full of books and delivering them to disadvantaged libraries. They see a real interest in fair trade. So right now, they're actually lobbying Warner Brothers to make fair trade chocolates, as for the Harry Potter movie chocolates. Most of their work, though, has been around gender equality. And looking at the pro-equality messages within the books. Or I even look at a group like the DREAM activists who are looking for legislative change at Congress, but who are really looking for sort of a social and normative change. This whole idea of coming out as undocumented and using spaces like YouTube to sort of stand up and say, this is who I am, this is my dream, this is what I want to get out of my life as an American. This has become a really powerful way to sort of create and disseminate media. Now, I'm starting to get some sort of themes that are cutting through this. The first theme for me is that almost all of this civic participation and this media participation is deeply participatory. You're not there just as a passive audience. You are a creator as well as a consumer. And this is true not just in posting a Facebook update and reading your Facebook friends, but in being part of a movement. In being part of a movement, we have a real tendency to sort of ask people to show up. I want you to donate. I want you to show up to the performance. I want you to show up to the rally. We're asking people in this generation to get involved with their heads as well as their feet. Not just to show up at the event, but to figure out, how do we structure this? How do we lead this? What are the new ideas that we take on? Now, there are some really complicated downsides about this. When you start working with people in their 20s who are looking for civic change, you discover that they're incredibly suspicious of institutions. They really want to see the impact of what they're doing. And if they can't figure out how their involvement, their participation is getting to their goals, they will disengage very, very quickly, and often yelling at you in the process. And this is why we're starting to see things like Kiva, where you can go and directly support a micro-entrepreneur. And again, there's a 20-minute conversation on the side about whether Kiva actually directly supports micro-entrepreneurs. But the idea that your $25 can go to someone you know is something that Kiva has really built itself and sold it on. And it's something that Donors Choose has done a great deal with. If you're concerned about education, you don't just go after reforming the Department of Ed or figuring out how your state's school board works. You give money to the classroom in your community that's working on a project that you care about. And these are enormously interesting platforms to this generation. There is a reason that this is the generation that has been pushing forward crowdfunding and pushing forward Kickstarter, which has become an utterly massive arts funder, although in a very, very different way than we are used to thinking about it. And it's impossibly small, and you can't see it, but I'll post these online. But I picked some of the top projects in the arts that have been funded by Kickstarter. And on the one hand, there's something really exciting about this. There are really ambitious projects that are coming out and getting funding. But they tend to be in fields where you would expect there to be funding. They tend to be around popular music. They tend to be around games. They tend to be around video. It's really hard to fund dance and theater through Kickstarter. It turns out that it's not working incredibly well. And it has some really dark downsides. It's quite possible that one of the real problems of Kickstarter is that we're asking the arts community to support itself. This was someone's wonderful Kickstarter project where they basically said, look, I'm an artist, I'm surrounded by artists. If I'm going to be a member of this community, I really need $5,000 so I can buy into everybody else's Kickstarter project. And what was sort of wonderful about it is that people started giving him money to back other people's Kickstarters, which I thought was just fantastic. But it's been trickier for other institutions. When you had the New York City Opera hitting this financial crisis that it recently went through, they came to Kickstarter, and I would have to say very naively, made the largest ask we have ever seen from an opera or a theater company. And one of the things that was so challenging about this ask was that they'd never done anything on Kickstarter before. And they had no idea how to use the tool, how to interact, how to deal with it. And they actually did surprisingly well. They got about $300,000 worth of commitment, but as everyone knows, not enough to keep the doors open, not enough to keep it going. The people who have been incredibly successful on Kickstarter are people like Amanda Palmer who live in this space. Amanda Palmer woke up a lot of people to this space by raising a ludicrous amount of money, $1.2 million to record an album. But one of the useful things to remember about Amanda Palmer is that this is where she lives. For people who are not used to reading Twitter, she has almost 1 million followers. That is an incredibly big number. The really big number is how often she tweets. She has tweeted herself personally 53,000 times. This is the world that she lives in. This is her community. It was very natural for her to go to this community to find the support for the work that she did. And it's work that works very, very well for this particular young audience. It's also not free. If you start looking at what Palmer put on the table, she ended up giving an enormous amount of her time going to people's houses to play house parties. And much of that donation came in sort of $10,000 slices, not $5 at a time, where she was making very big personal commitments to those people that she was getting involved with. My point in this is not that Kickstarter's good or that Kickstarter's bad. My point is to sort of give you a lens on how I'm thinking about this young generation. Some are calling them digital natives. Some are sort of thinking of them as simply the generation that grew up on Facebook or grew up on Twitter. I see this generation as really characterized by two ideas. They are engaged in the world that's incredibly participatory. If they can't see a way to be directly involved and directly have an impact, they're often going to fall back. They're not interested necessarily in giving $100 to an existing cultural institution. They want to see that they are helping shape where that institution goes, shape a project where they have a personal relationship to it. And they are really, really not interested in big sweeping movements. They are looking at the world in this sort of pointillist lens. They are following a small number of individual passions. This is a group that isn't particularly interested in political parties. It's really interested in those sort of small point impacts. And this has real challenges as we start moving into the world of civics. We know a lot about party politics. We know a lot about how to live in a world where there's 2 or 3 or 5 parties, and if you know the party that someone is in, you know who they are and you know what they think. But that's not the space that we're in right now. Right now, you might find someone who's really passionate about 2 or 3 different things and trying to figure out how they act in a civic space, how they have impact, is a very challenging, open question. One of the things that we hope for out of this sort of pointillist worldview is that it all sort of works out and that everybody sort of gets together. I really care about Africa, as it turns out, and I really care about global warming and alternative energy, and maybe I'm not as involved in human rights issues or arts issues, but you are, and if we hang out together, we might collectively represent an interlocking public. All together, we might actually care and become knowledgeable and sort of think about all those issues. And this is a really optimistic view, and on good days, this is sort of what I hope for out of this, and on bad days, this is what I worry about. And this is an image of birds of a feather flocking together. It's a sociological tendency called homophily. And homophily is an incredibly powerful force in sociology. It's one of the best documented phenomena. If you look at almost any assemblage of people, people will gravitate towards people that they have similar ties to. Socioeconomic similarities, religious similarities, people who come from the same place. It's documented all over the place, particularly at colleges and universities, where you watch all the black kids sort to one table, and all the kids from Michigan sort to one table, and all the kids who are math majors sort to one table. And I've just written a book that sort of looks at this in the internet space, and it turns out that near as I can tell, this tendency is even more pronounced online than it is pronounced offline. And the reason for that are the ways we look at information online all really play into homophily. When we look at a curator like the New York Times knows what its audience wants. It knows that that audience cares a lot more about North America than it does about sub-Saharan Africa. And because that audience has a whole lot in common, they have an image of the New York Times readers who have certain tendencies in common, you end up with systemic biases over long periods of time. So one of the things that people really cheered for in the digital age was, we're free from the New York Times, now we can find exactly what we want. But when we find exactly what we want, we tend to be led to what we already care about. So again, I care about Africa and I care about alternative energy. I don't care about human rights, I don't care about dance, and I don't find anything out about it. And the solution that people are now putting on the table is this whole new notion of social search. And the idea there is, again, we're going to go to your community. We're basically going to say, maybe you don't know about it, maybe you don't care about it, but maybe your neighbors and your friends will know about it. And this works incredibly well if all the people you know on Facebook are incredibly diverse. If you're friends with the United Nations, you might well get a really wonderful, diverse picture of the world. But on average, we're friends with 130 people. 73% of them are people that we know from our offline lives. They tend to be people we went to high school with. That's the dominant category of people that we're connected to. Right now, the internet, in many ways, seems to be bringing us back to the same people that we already knew and already paid attention to. And in the civic space, it may be bringing us to the same issues and the same causes that we already cared about, and we don't end up looking into that broader interlocking social space. So I use this slide a lot in my talks. And on the left, we have Picasso. On the right, we have a fawn mask from Benin. And normally, when I'm showing this slide, the point that I'm trying to make is that one of the things that we know from social science is that cognitive diversity is incredibly important for success. There's this brilliant guy, Ronald Burt, did a great study at Raytheon where he figured out that the most creative people in a very uncreative organization were people who talked to people all throughout the organization. If you were locked in an office, if you were just off in one corner of the organization, you had very bad ideas as measured by management there. If you talked to people all throughout the organization, if you had the cognitively diverse experience of talking to a lot of people, as he puts it, you are at extremely high risk of having good ideas. And what he ended up saying from this is that creativity is not so much a function of genius. As remarkable as Picasso was, creativity is an import-export business. It's about seeing something in another culture and figuring out how to bring it into your local culture where it may have different implications. So that's normally what I talk about when I talk about this slide, but I want to talk about something much more specific here. Because I think for this audience, I think the arts have a very special responsibility in this space. So my argument so far is this, right? We have a new generation of folks. They are very interested in participating, but they participate based on passion, which means they tend to have this really fragmented view of the world. And it turns out that even with the internet, it can be very, very hard to get that much broader view of the world. And there's a whole lot to say about how you get a broader view of the world, but one of the shortcuts that we know of is through your passions, and arts are often your passions. One of the things that I end up talking about a lot in the book is this notion of bridge figures and xenophiles. We really need people from one culture to sort of step up and sort of say, let me introduce you to my culture. And when Paul Simon decided that he was going to violate the apartheid boycott and go and record Graceland in South Africa, he had amazing help from a record producer named Hilton Rosenthal, who was the first white producer to be recording interracial bands in South Africa at that point. So you had Rosenthal, who was a bridge figure. He knew South Africa well. He knew the music scene. He could bring in Paul Simon as a xenophile, someone looking for that influence of another culture, and build a bridge that didn't exist before. And we see this again and again. One of the stories that I end up talking about in the book is how Journey, now this is not a group that's particularly interested in funding Journey's new album, but Journey's a big deal for certain people. If you own acid jeans in your closet, you probably care about Journey, which hadn't toured for a very long time because they had no lead singer until they found this awesome Filipino dude, Arnel Pineda, to stand up and front the band, and now their last album was Journey Live in Manila. So it turns out that arts are this incredible tool for connection. And we see it all over the place internationally. We see people connecting into places where they didn't think they had any interest, any connection. One of the questions I want to leave you with is, how do the arts help us around this question of cultural diversity? How do the arts help us in our communities, whether they're local, whether they're global? How do they end up being a shortcut in sort of taking us out of some of these echo chambers, some of these isolated points of view that simply characterize this particular moment in civics? I want to leave you with this other question. How do we think about these big institutions which didn't grow up in this age and which are really struggling to figure out what they do in this age? How do we make sure that we don't lose the New York Opera as well as having someone like Amanda Palmer who knows how to play in this space? How do we play on both sides of it? And then critically for me, how do we think about these innovators who are rethinking art in this participatory age, who are thinking about these different models of support, these different models of who art reaches, how they interact? And I'm leaving you with questions because I've actually seen the next performance, and I know that you're going to have a lot of questions about that as well. So think of this as a lunch that gives you questions. Those questions are going to be, how did they do that? That was marvelous. I hope these questions spark some ideas. I'd love to stay in touch and in dialogue on it. That's me on Twitter. That's me on email. Thank you for your time.